Tonight, we're going to talk about a year the world believed it understood. A year when merchants still counted their florins by candlelight, when monks still copied their manuscripts in quiet scriptoriums, and when the great cathedrals still rose stone by patient stone toward a sky no one imagined could ever turn against them. Have you ever wondered how a civilization so certain of its own permanence, so bound together by faith and trade and inherited tradition, could stand at the very edge of an abyss and not sense the ground beneath its feet was about to give way? Tonight we return to that year, 1347, and to the long, ordinary breath the medieval world took before everything it knew began to change. This is not a story that begins with disaster. It begins with a world that believed itself sturdy, aged, and blessed by heaven. So before we step into that world together, take a moment to like the video and to subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy the kind of slow and careful histories I bring here. And as you settle in, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what hour it is where you are. It is one of my quiet pleasures to imagine so many of you scattered across time zones, listening softly in the dark. Now dim the lights, perhaps turn on a soft fan, or let the sound of gentle rain fill the corners of the room. Lie back, close your eyes if you wish, and let the medieval world rise slowly around you as it was in the last untroubled autumn it would ever know. In the middle years of the 14th century, Europe was not a single country, and yet it was in many ways a single world. From the muddy fields of England to the marble courtyards of Florence, from the timber halls of the Rhineland to the sun-warmed harbours of Sicily, a shared rhythm bound millions of people together. That rhythm was made of church bells and market days, of harvest and Lent, of oaths sworn between lord and vassal, of prayers whispered before sleep. It was not a peaceful world, and it was not a fair one, but it was a world that believed it knew itself, and that belief was itself a kind of comfort. The great cities of Europe pulsed with a life that would have astonished their grandfathers. Florence and Venice, Paris and Ghent, Bruges and London, each had grown crowded and confident in the decades before our story begins. Streets narrowed between tall timbered houses, spilling smoke and laundry and the smell of baking bread into the air. Guilds regulated crafts with jealous precision. Notaries drafted contracts by the thousand. Money changers weighed coins from lands so distant that most of the people passing them could not have said where those lands lay. Trade fairs at Champagne had once been the great meeting place of merchants from every direction, and although that particular institution had passed its peak, its spirit had spread outward into every corner of the continent. Commerce had become the quiet lifeblood of Christian Europe, moving wool, wine, salt, iron, spice, silver, and story from hand to hand along roads that had been walked for 1,000 years. The Mediterranean itself was the great artery of this world. The Italian maritime republics, above all Genoa and Venice, had built themselves into wealthy powers by mastering the sea. Their galleys sailed from the Black Sea to the ports of the Levant, from the harbors of Egypt to the coasts of France and Spain. They carried silks and spices from farther east, from lands ruled by the Mongol Khans, where a merchant with courage and a good pass could travel from the Crimea all the way to China with a reasonable hope of surviving the journey. This vast network of exchange was known as the Pax Mongolica, the peace held in place by the descendants of Genghis Khan. It was under this peace that the world felt, in some sense, smaller than it had ever been. Ideas and goods moved further, faster, and more reliably than they had in living memory. It was, on the surface, a hopeful age. Yet if you had walked those cobbled streets in the autumn of 1347, you would have found a world already trembling beneath its own confidence, though few could have said exactly why. The years before had been unkind. In the first decades of the century, a great famine had swept the continent, brought on by strange weather and failing harvests. Rains had fallen when they should not have. Summers had turned cold and wet. Grain had rotted in the fields, and thousands upon thousands had died quietly in villages whose names have long since faded. Historians would later come to speak of a slow climatic shift in these decades, a gradual cooling that stressed the fragile agricultural systems on which every kingdom rested. To the people alive at the time, however, this was not climate. It was hardship. It was the way the world was, and the way it had always been for as long as anyone could remember. Alongside hunger came war. In the north, England and France had begun the long, gnawing conflict later generations would call the Hundred Years' War. Armies moved through the countryside, requisitioning food, burning what they could not carry, leaving villages emptier than they had found them. In Italy, the great cities feuded with one another in shifting alliances that no one could fully follow. Mercenary companies wandered the roads. Robber knights held bridges for ransom. Yet even amid this violence, the underlying frame of medieval life held firm. Fields were sown, bells were rung, fairs still opened at their appointed times. The church still crowned kings and buried peasants and mediated the passage of every soul from cradle to grave. That church was, in many ways, the beating heart of the medieval world. To be a Christian in 14th century Europe was not simply to hold a private belief. It was to belong to a vast, visible community that reached from the smallest village chapel to the great papal court, then residing not in Rome, but in Avignon. This was the age of what would later be called the Avignon papacy, when a succession of French popes ruled Christendom from a palace beside the Rhone. The church owned land, collected tithes, ran hospitals, staffed universities, and shaped the moral imagination of every soul within its reach. Its calendar governed the year. Its saints watched over travelers and mothers and craftsmen. Its liturgy filled the air with Latin words that most listeners could not translate, but whose cadence they knew as intimately as the sound of their own breathing. Beneath the church stood the great order of feudal society, an inheritance from earlier centuries that had bent and shifted but had not broken. In its simplest form, this order divided humankind into three estates. There were those who prayed, meaning the clergy. There were those who fought, meaning the nobles and the knights. And there were those who worked, meaning the vast majority of the population, the peasants who tilled the fields, tended the animals, and paid the dues that kept everyone else fed. In some regions, especially in the east and in parts of France, many of these peasants were serfs, legally bound to the land on which they had been born, unable to leave without their lord's permission. In others, especially in the growing cities of the north and in parts of England, freedom of movement was greater, though not by much. Everywhere, life was shaped by obligation, by custom, by the sense that one had a place in a divinely ordered whole. This entire structure rested, in the end, on people, on healthy bodies, on hands that could sow and reap, on backs that could carry, on voices that could sing psalms and take oaths and haggle over a bushel of grain. It rested on the assumption that there would always be more people than land, more workers than places to put them, more mouths than a good harvest could quite fill. For centuries, this assumption had held. Population had grown steadily since the years around the first millennium, filling up the arable land, pushing settlement into forests and marshes and highland pastures. By the early 14th century, some regions were straining under this weight. When the Great Famine came, it fell on a Europe that had, in a sense, run out of room. Yet even after those years of hunger, the underlying pattern remained. Europe was, above all, a crowded and interconnected world. And this is what makes the arrival of what was coming so difficult to imagine, even for us, looking back with all the hindsight the centuries have granted. The medieval world of 1347 was not fragile in the way a candle is fragile. It was fragile in the way a great old house is fragile, one whose beams have quietly rotted while its facade still glows with paint. From the outside, everything appeared as it had always appeared. The bells rang. The fields were ploughed. The Pope in Avignon dictated letters to bishops on distant frontiers. The Genoese counted their coins in trading colonies on the far shores of the Black Sea. The world was busy with itself, and busy people rarely look up. Somewhere out there, however, along the caravan roads of Central Asia, in the marmot burrows of the steppe, in the fur of black rats that scurried through the holds of merchant ships, something was already moving. It moved slowly at first, at the pace of pack camels and coasting galleys. It moved without announcement, without warning, without any of the drama that later generations would give it. It moved through the same routes that carried silk and pepper and salted fish, through the same ports where merchants embraced old friends and priests blessed new voyages. And in October of that year, in the harbor of a Sicilian city called Messina, 12 Genoese galleys would appear on the horizon at dusk, their sails ragged, their crews half dead at the oars. The people of Messina would go down to the docks to greet them, as they had greeted 1,000 ships before, and they would not yet know that history itself had just come ashore. But that is a story for tomorrow evening or for the next section of our long night together. For now, let the medieval world settle around you as it settled that autumn, quiet, ordinary, unaware, gathered like a great candle in the dark, still burning steadily, still throwing its warm light across the fields and the cathedrals and the sleeping villages of a continent about to be changed forever. The harbour of Messina in the autumn of 1347 was one of the busiest crossroads of the Mediterranean world, though it did not think of itself in such grand terms. To those who lived there, it was simply the port, a familiar arc of stone and timber that curved along the strait between Sicily and the Italian mainland. Fishermen mended nets on the quays. Dockworkers unloaded barrels of wine and sacks of grain from vessels that had come from every corner of the sea. Merchants haggled in half a dozen languages, their voices rising and falling with the tides. Above the harbour, the city climbed in a jumble of red tile roofs and narrow lanes, punctuated by the pale bulk of churches whose bells marked the hours with steady authority. It was a city that had seen fleets come and go for 1,000 years, and it did not startle easily. October arrived with the slow softening of light that comes to Sicily as the summer fades. The sea grew calmer, the winds gentler, the air still warm at midday but cool by evening. Ships came in from Genoa, from Naples, from the Levant, from ports whose names sang of distance. The Genoese, in particular, were familiar visitors. Their trading colonies stretched all the way to the Black Sea, to a place called Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula, where they had built a walled town and a bustling port on the very edge of the Mongol world. From Kaffa, spices and silks flowed westward along with grain and salted fish and slaves, all carried by galleys that knew these waters as intimately as any sailor knows the shape of his own hand. It was near the middle of the month, or perhaps a little later, when 12 such galleys were sighted approaching Messina from the east. Their approach was unusual. They did not come in briskly under sail, tacking with the confidence of a well-run fleet. They drifted. Their oars struck the water unevenly, as if the men below did not have the strength to keep time. Their sails hung strangely. From the docks, watchers gathered as they always did, shading their eyes and calling out speculations, expecting perhaps a storm-damaged convoy that would need repairs and comfort. What they saw when the ships drew closer silenced them. The decks were half empty. Men lay where they had fallen. Others moved with the slow, staggering care of the very ill. Some of the sailors could not stand at all, and those who could were marked in ways that struck the watchers as strange, even before anyone had a name for what they were seeing. Dark swellings had risen at their necks and beneath their arms. Faces were fevered, blotched, hollow-eyed. Later chroniclers would say that the sailors carried a sickness in their bones, a sickness that had followed them from the east, from Kaffa and beyond, across the long sea road that had brought them home. The authorities of Messina reacted with the instinct of a city that had lived by trade for centuries. They tried to send the ships away. They ordered the crews not to disembark, to take their sickness with them and go elsewhere. But it was already too late. Sailors had come ashore. Goods had been unloaded. Rats had leapt from mooring lines to the pilings and slipped into the alleys of the port. Fleas, invisible and patient, had travelled with them. The city closed its gates against ghosts that were already inside its walls. We know now, though the people of Messina could not have known, that what stepped ashore that October was almost certainly the bacterium later called Yersinia pestis. It was ancient. It had lived for uncounted generations in the burrows of wild rodents on the great grasslands of Central Asia, quietly cycling between marmots and fleas and mice, occasionally spilling into human populations when circumstances allowed. In the years before 1347, something had changed. Historians and scientists still debate exactly what. It may have been shifts in climate along the steppe. It may have been the disruptions of Mongol warfare, which pushed peoples and armies and their vermin across new distances. It may have been the intensifying trade of the Pax Mongolica itself, which connected the burrows of Asia to the granaries of Europe through a chain of caravans, ports, and ship, holds so continuous that a single infected rat could could travel 1,000 miles without ever leaving the shelter of stored grain. Whatever the cause, the disease had already been at work for years before it reached Sicily. It had struck the Crimean city of Caffa in a scene that would later become one of the most notorious in the history of siege warfare. According to a chronicler named Gabriel de Mussy, who was writing at a distance, and with some literary embellishment, a Mongol army besieging the Genoese colony had been ravaged by plague, and in a moment of desperate cruelty had catapulted the bodies of their own dead over the walls. The defenders, he wrote, had hurled the corpses back into the sea, but the sickness had already taken root among them. When the Genoese ships fled home, they carried it with them. Modern historians treat this account with caution, for the disease would have spread by many routes regardless of any single act. But the image endures because it captures something true, that in this moment war and trade and pestilence had become part of the same great human motion, and that no wall, however thick, could keep them apart. Whatever the precise pathway, the ships came, and Messina fell first. Within days, then weeks, the sickness moved outward from the harbour into the streets, into the churches, into the homes where families gathered around evening fires. Its symptoms were terrible and precise. It began, most often, with a sudden fever and a heavy weariness, as though the body had aged decades in a single afternoon. Then came the swellings, hard and painful, rising at the neck, the armpits, the groin. They would grow to the size of an apple, sometimes larger. Physicians would later call them buboes, from an old Greek word, and it is from these that the disease would take one of its enduring names, the bubonic plague. Dark blotches spread across the skin. Some of the sick vomited blood, some coughed it. Death often came within 3 or 4 days, sometimes within hours, sometimes with the strange mercy of unconsciousness, sometimes not. What made the sickness so terrible was not only its speed, but its intimacy. It seemed to move through the very air between people. To sit at a bedside was to invite it in. To touch a garment, to share a cup, to breathe the same close winter room, all these ordinary acts of care became acts of danger. Modern science would later distinguish the different forms of the disease. The bubonic form, spread chiefly by the bite of infected fleas. The pneumonic form, which settled in the lungs and passed from person to person on droplets of breath. The septicemic form, which flooded the bloodstream and killed almost as fast as it appeared. In the streets of Messina, and soon of many other cities, these forms overlapped and blurred, and the people who lived through them saw only one thing, a sickness that came upon them like a thief and left almost no one it had touched. Word of what was happening in Messina traveled quickly, as bad news does. It moved along the coasts, from harbour to harbour, carried by frightened travellers and by the very ships that were still leaving despite everything. The Sicilians, when they understood what had come among them, tried to expel the Genoese vessels and everyone who had come with them. Some ships were driven off. They simply sailed elsewhere, to Marseille on the southern coast of France, to Genoa itself, still unaware that its own returning fleet would bring the sickness home. To the ports of Sardinia, of Corsica, of the Balearic Islands. Everywhere they went, the same pattern repeated. First the sailors, then the dockworkers, then the neighborhoods along the harbor, then the whole city. It was as though a single invisible thread were being drawn through the map of the Mediterranean, tightening as it went. By November, the sickness had reached the Sicilian countryside, sweeping through inland towns whose names have been forgotten by all but the most patient historians. By December, it had crossed to the mainland of Italy and touched the ports of the west. In January of 1348, it appeared in Marseille, and from there it began its slow march inland along the Rhone valley, following the roads and the rivers, following the merchants and the pilgrims, following the ordinary human motion of a world that had no way to know that motion itself had become dangerous. In the same weeks it reached Genoa, and then Venice, and then Pisa, and the great commercial heart of Italy began to fill with the sound of church bells rung for the dead. In Messina, the first city struck. The horror of those early weeks left marks that later writers would try to describe and never quite succeed. A Franciscan friar named Michel de Piazza, writing not long afterward, recalled how the sick were abandoned by their own families, how priests refused to hear confessions, how the dead lay in the streets because no one dared to touch them. He described people fleeing into the fields and vineyards outside the walls, believing that clean country air might save them, and dying there instead among the vines. He described the sudden collapse of ordinary custom, the way that funerals shrank from great processions to hurried burials to nothing at all. Whether every detail of his account is exact, or whether some of it is the shocked memory of a man trying to bear witness to something too large for any single mind, we cannot always say. What we can say is that his voice, and the voices of many like him across the coming years, all carry the same underlying note. It is the sound of a world discovering that it does not know itself as well as it thought it did. For the medieval mind, this discovery was not simply frightening. It was disorienting at a level that touched the foundations of belief. Sickness was familiar, death was familiar, but sickness on this scale, striking rich and poor, young and old, sinner and saint alike, seemed to violate the order of the world itself. Preachers reached for the book of Revelation. Astrologers reached for the strange conjunction of planets that had been observed in 1345, when Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had aligned in the sign of Aquarius, an event the learned physicians of Paris would later blame in a famous report. Ordinary people reached for older explanations still, older than Christianity, older than record. They spoke of poisoned wells, of evil winds, of angry stars, of the wrath of a god whose patience with humanity had at last run out. And through it all, the ships kept coming. The roads kept carrying travelers. The bells kept ringing, though more and more of them rang now for the dead. The medieval world, which had believed itself so sturdy only a season before, was beginning, quietly and without knowing it, to come apart in the hands of the people who loved it most. By the first months of 1348, the sickness that had come ashore at Messina was no longer a Sicilian sorrow. It had become a Mediterranean one, and it was reaching hungrily toward the heart of the continent. To understand how it moved, we must picture the map as the people of that age understood it, not as a grid of borders and highways, but as a living web of coasts and rivers and old Roman roads, each thread carrying its own traffic of merchants and pilgrims and messengers. It was along these threads, patient and unhurried, that the plague traveled north. Genoa was among the first great cities of the mainland to feel it fully. The city had watched its own returning galleys with growing dread through the autumn, and had tried, like Messina, to turn them away. Some of the ships were driven off with fire arrows before they could land. Others slipped in quietly at night or moored in nearby coves, and the sickness came ashore with them anyway. By January, the narrow lanes of Genoa were filled with the sound of doors being nailed shut, of families sealed inside their own houses with whoever had fallen ill, of carts creaking through the dark to collect the dead before dawn. The great mercantile republic, which had built its wealth on the movement of goods across enormous distances, discovered that the same routes could carry ruin as easily as spice. Venice, too, closed her canals against the world, and too late. The Venetians, with their long experience of ships arriving from every coast of the Mediterranean, may have been among the earliest to grasp the connection between vessels and sickness, though they still could not name the cause. They began, in these months, to hold arriving crews at anchor beyond the lagoon for a set number of days, watching to see whether illness would appear among them. The practice would eventually give us a word we still use, quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. It was one of the first serious attempts to fight the disease with human ingenuity rather than with prayer alone, and it was, at best, a partial shield. The rats and their fleas cared nothing for calendars. The sickness slipped through the gates of Venice as it slipped through every other gate, and by the spring, the city of canals was burying more than 500 souls a day, if the chroniclers can be believed at all. From the Italian ports, the plague fanned outward with terrifying steadiness. It followed the roads north through Tuscany, into the valleys of the Arno and the Po. It climbed the passes of the Alps, though it moved more slowly there, hindered by cold and by the thinner traffic of winter. It reached Marseille, and from Marseille it began its long walk up the Rhone toward Avignon, where the Pope himself lived and where the whole administration of the Western Church had gathered around him. It reached Barcelona and moved along the coasts of Aragon and Castile. By the summer of 1348, southern France was suffering openly, and the sickness had begun to work its way into the countryside of Provence, of Languedoc, of Catalonia, into the small villages where a single infected traveller could undo an entire community within a fortnight. The most vivid witness we have to these months speaks to us from Florence, and his name was Giovanni Boccaccio. He was a poet and a storyteller, not a physician, and his account of the plague year in his native city sits at the beginning of a book he would call the Decameron. In his opening pages, before he begins the tales themselves, he describes what he saw. He describes how the sickness arrived in Florence in the spring of 1348, how it began among a few and became a torrent, how the buboes rose on the bodies of the stricken, how death came sometimes within a day. He describes how the healthy fled from the sick, and how, in that fleeing, the ordinary bonds of family began to dissolve. Fathers abandoned children, husbands abandoned wives, servants abandoned masters, and masters abandoned servants. Some households locked themselves away with hoarded food and would not open their doors to any voice from outside. Others threw open the wine cellars and gave themselves to a last, feverish gaiety, singing and drinking through the nights, as if to defy the silence that pressed in on them from the streets. It is Boccaccio who gives us the small, unforgettable image of 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, who agree to leave the city together and retreat to a country villa in the hills. There, in gardens still full of song and shade, they resolve to tell one another stories, one each day, for 10 days, and so pass the time until the sickness has spent itself. It is a literary device, of course, a frame for the 100 tales that follow, but it also captures something true about that year. Those who could flee, fled. Cities emptied outward into the countryside as the wealthy sought refuge in their villas, their manors, their country estates, carrying with them, unknowingly, the very thing they hoped to escape. The roads were crowded with carriages and pack animals and frightened families, and behind them, along the same roads, came the plague. Boccaccio's Florence was not gentle to its dead. He describes how the traditional funeral customs, the long processions of neighbors, the tolling of bells, the elegies pronounced over the coffin, all collapsed under the sheer weight of loss. In the early weeks, families still tried to bury their dead with dignity. Soon it became impossible. Bodies were laid out in doorways in the mornings, waiting for men who wandered the streets with carts. Great trenches were dug at the edge of the city, and the dead were tipped into them in layers, one row after another, covered with a little earth, until the trench was full and another had to be opened. Priests hurried through the last rites when they could, and when they could not, they simply prayed over the pit from a distance. The bells rang so often, and for so many, that in the end some cities forbade their ringing entirely, because the constant sound had begun to break the spirits of the living. The chroniclers of these months are many, and though they wrote in different languages and different corners of Europe, their words share a strange family resemblance. Agnolo di Tura, a shoemaker of Siena, kept a private record of what he witnessed in his city. He wrote of how the plague began in May of 1348, and how within a short time it seemed that no one would be left alive. He wrote, with the terrible plainness of a man who has run out of language, that he had buried 5 of his own children with his own hands, and that so many died on every side that all believed it was the end of the world. In his account, we hear no theology, no astrology, no learned diagnosis. We hear only a father digging. In Paris, the great medical faculty of the university was asked by King Philip VI to explain what was happening. Their response, drafted in October of 1348, has come down to us as one of the most famous documents of the age. It combined the best learning available to educated Europe with a helplessness so profound that it fairly leaks between the lines. The masters of Paris pointed to the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius, which had occurred on the 20th of March in 1345. This alignment, they explained, had corrupted the air, drawing up evil vapors from the sea and the earth. These vapors, borne on southern winds, had spread across the continent and now entered the bodies of the vulnerable through the breath, taking hold in weak hearts and moist complexions. They advised avoiding damp places, keeping fires burning to purify the air, eating light foods, avoiding sexual activity, and above all avoiding fear, since fear itself, they said, opened the body to the disease. They meant every word of it. In the framework of medieval medicine, inherited from the Greeks and refined by generations of Islamic and Latin scholars, this was the most sophisticated explanation available. That it did almost no good is not a mark of stupidity. It is a mark of how utterly the world had encountered something it did not yet have the tools to understand. Beyond the learned schools, ordinary people did what people have always done in the presence of terror. They sought reasons that fit the shape of their world. Some blamed the alignment of the stars. Some blamed the corruption of the church, whose wealth and worldliness had, they whispered, at last angered a patient God. Some blamed foreigners, or lepers, or beggars, or the poor themselves. And in many places, above all in the towns of the Rhineland, and along the trade routes of Central Europe, terrible violence began to fall upon the Jewish communities, who were accused, with no evidence and against all reason, of poisoning the wells that fed Christian towns. We will come to those horrors more fully in the sections ahead, for they form one of the darkest chapters in a story already dark beyond measure. For now, it is enough to say that as the plague moved, so did rumor, and rumor was often crueler than the disease. Through it all, the sickness kept its own slow, methodical pace. In late 1348 and early 1349, it crossed the English Channel, carried, in one account, aboard a ship that made landfall at the small port of Melcombe Regis on the southern coast of England, in what is now Dorset. From there, it spread through the villages of the West Country, then into Bristol, and then along the roads to London. By the summer of 1349, it had reached Ireland and Scotland. By the following year, it had begun to move eastward into the German lands, then northward into Scandinavia, then further still, until Norwegian ports too were burying their dead in mass grave. Wherever it went, the story repeated itself. First a rumor, then a few strange deaths, then the buboes rising on the necks of neighbors, then the bells, and then the silence when the bells could no longer be rung. And yet, even in the midst of this darkness, life continued in its stubborn, ordinary way. Bread was still baked, though by fewer hands. Children were still born, though many did not survive their first year. Farmers still tried to plant, though the seed sometimes went into ground no one would ever harvest. The world was not ending, though many believed it was. It was, instead, being changed at the deepest possible level in ways that no one alive in that hour could yet see. And in a marble palace beside the Rhone, an old and thoughtful pope was about to face a decision that would test both his faith and his conscience, and that would set him, quietly, against the worst impulses of his frightened age. The city of Avignon in the year 1348 was one of the strangest capitals in the history of the Church. It was not Rome, and yet it was, for the moment, the beating heart of Latin Christendom. Nearly 40 years earlier, the papacy had removed itself from the endless quarrels of the Italian peninsula and taken up residence beside the slow, grey Rhone, in a small city on the border of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Successive popes had built and expanded a great palace of pale stone above the river, a palace that still stands today, and around it had grown a court of cardinals, secretaries, notaries, cooks, jewelers, bankers, physicians, and hangers on of every kind. Avignon in these years was crowded, cosmopolitan, and famously wealthy. It had also become, in the eyes of many, a symbol of the Church's entanglement with the world. When the plague arrived at its gates in the spring of 1348, it arrived at a city that liked to think of itself as a small, brilliant image of civilization itself. The Pope who sat upon the throne of St. Peter in that year was Clement VI. He had been born Pier Roger in a noble family of the Limousin, and he had risen through the Church with the smooth confidence of a man who understood both scripture and statecraft. He was cultivated, generous, fond of music and art, a patron of scholars, a lover of ceremony. He had been elected in 1342, and by 1348 he was a man in the fullness of his powers, respected across Europe as a diplomat and as a prince of the Church. He had a reputation for grandeur that his critics deplored and his supporters admired. What almost no one had yet seen in him, because it had not yet been asked of him, was a quieter capacity for moral courage. That capacity would be tested that year in ways he could not have imagined when he first put on the papal tiara. The plague reached Avignon in the early months of 1348, carried up from Marseille along the Rhone. It settled first among the poorer quarters, where the houses leaned close together and the streets ran with the ordinary filth of any medieval town. It moved swiftly into the households of merchants and artisans, and then it climbed the hill to the papal palace itself. Cardinals began to fall ill. Members of the papal household died in their beds. Physicians attended one funeral after another until at last they too began to sicken. In the middle of all this, Clement's personal doctor, a Frenchman named Guy de Chauliac, remained at his post. Guy de Chauliac was one of the finest medical minds of the age, the author of a great surgical treatise that would guide European medicine for centuries. He was clear-eyed, careful, and honest. He would later write about the plague from bitter experience, for he himself would fall ill and survive, and he would describe the disease in terms so precise that modern scholars still find his observations useful. It was Guy de Chauliac, according to tradition, who prescribed one of the most famous strange remedies of the papal year. He ordered that the Pope should be kept in his private chamber, alone, and that two great fires should be built and maintained there day and night, one on either side of him. The idea was rooted in the medical theory of the time. If corrupted air was the source of the plague, then hot, dry fire might burn away its poison before it could reach the Pope's body. So Clement VI, in the peak of that terrible summer, sat between two roaring fires in a stone chamber in Provence, while outside his windows a city died. He did not leave his rooms. He received only those attendants who had to come. Whether it was the fires that saved him, or simple isolation, or the luck of a body that resisted the disease, no one can say. But he lived, and while he lived, he governed, and in that governing he did something for which history has been slow, but not entirely unwilling, to remember him. For as the plague moved through Europe, so had a terrible rumor. It began, so far as we can tell, in the towns along the Swiss and southern German frontier in the second half of 1348, and it spread with the same appalling ease as the disease itself. The rumor claimed that the Jews were responsible for the plague. It claimed that they had gathered in secret councils, that they had received poisons from mysterious sources in the east, and that they had crept in the night to Christian wells and springs and cast these poisons into the waters. The rumor claimed that this was the reason so many Christians died so suddenly, and it claimed, most cruelly of all, that this was why some Jews seemed to die in smaller numbers than their neighbors, a claim that had more to do with the geography of Jewish quarters and with dietary and hygienic customs than with any conspiracy, but which fitted neatly into a mind already looking for a monster. The rumor did what rumors of that kind do. It gave frightened people a place to put their fear. It gave grieving people a place to put their rage. It gave debtors a reason to hope that their creditors, many of whom in that age were Jewish moneylenders, might be conveniently removed. And once it had begun, it moved from town to town along the same roads that carried the plague. In the winter of 1348 and the spring of 1349, Jewish communities across a great arc of Europe were destroyed with a violence that is difficult even now to describe. In Strasbourg, on St. Valentine's Day of 1349, some 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a wooden house built for that purpose outside the walls of the city. In Basel, the Jewish community was locked in a house on an island in the Rhine and set on fire. In Erfurt, in Mainz, in Cologne, in Frankfurt, in dozens of towns whose names still stand today, the same story repeated itself with local variations. Sometimes the massacre came at the hands of ordinary townspeople, whipped into terror by preachers or by wandering flagellants. Sometimes it came at the direction of city councils, who used the accusation to seize Jewish property and cancel Jewish debts. In many cases, entire communities were wiped out before the plague itself had even reached the town in question, so that the killers had not even the wretched excuse of watching their own children die. Into this fire, Pope Clement VI raised his voice. He did so from his chamber between the flames in the summer and autumn of 1348. In two separate papal bulls, one in July and one in September of that year, he condemned the accusations against the Jews in the plainest possible terms. He pointed out, with the calm reasoning of a trained lawyer, that the plague was killing Jews as well as Christians, which it certainly was, and that Jews were dying in regions where no Christians blamed them, which was also true. He noted that the plague had appeared in places where no Jews lived at all. He declared that the accusations of well poisoning were false, that those who attacked Jews on this pretext were acting against the will of the church, and that anyone who killed a Jew without lawful trial was to be excommunicated. He commanded the bishops and the secular authorities under his jurisdiction to take Jews into their protection, to shelter them in their own houses if necessary, and to punish those who harmed them. It is important to speak carefully about what this meant and about what it did not mean. Clement VI was not a modern man, and he was not a champion of religious equality in any sense we would recognize today. He shared many of the ordinary prejudices of his time. The bulls that defended the Jews from the accusation of well poisoning also repeated older restrictions on Jewish life. He believed, as most Christians of his age believed, that the Jews had a subordinate place in Christian society, and he did not question that framework. What he did question, and what he refused to endorse, was the specific lie that had turned neighbors into killers. In an age of rumor, he insisted on facts. In an age of terror, he insisted on law. In an age of scapegoating, he insisted that the innocent should not be punished for the sins of a disease that struck without asking anyone's faith. This was not everything one might have wished. It was a great deal more than most of his contemporaries managed. His words did not stop the massacres. In many places they were ignored, or they arrived too late. In the towns of the Rhineland, in Alsace, in parts of Spain, local authorities either joined in the killings or looked the other way while they were done. But in Avignon itself, and in the papal territories nearby, Clement's protection had force. Jews fled to those lands and found shelter. The Pope opened his own city to them, and Avignon's Jewish community would survive the plague years when so many others were destroyed. Clement also personally sheltered Jews within his own household, according to some accounts. Later chroniclers, both Christian and Jewish, would remember what he had done. In the long, terrible history of relations between the medieval church and the Jewish people, his two bulls of 1348 stand as a moment when the papacy used its authority not to condemn, but to defend, and history, even a history as reluctant as the one that would later judge the Avignon papacy harshly, has not quite forgotten that fact. Meanwhile, along the roads outside Avignon, another movement was gathering. It was called the Flagellant Movement, and it was one of the strangest and most frightening spiritual responses of the entire plague year. Bands of men, sometimes hundreds strong, began to travel from town to town, dressed in white robes marked with red crosses, carrying whips of leather knotted with iron tips. They would enter a town in solemn procession, gather in the marketplace, stripped to the waist, and beat themselves bloody in the sight of the townspeople, chanting hymns and calling upon God to lift the plague. Their leaders preached that the disease was a punishment for the sins of humankind, and that only by shared, visible suffering could the wrath of heaven be turned aside. The people wept and knelt, and gave them food and shelter, and sometimes joined them. And when the flagellants moved on to the next town, the plague, more often than not, went with them, carried in their clothes, in their bodies, in the very fervour that had gathered so many strangers into a single crowd. Clement VI watched this movement with growing alarm. It was pious in appearance, and it was terrifying in effect. It bypassed the ordinary authority of parish priests and bishops. It preached repentance without confession, penance without the sacraments, and it carried within it, in the words of some of its more extreme preachers, dark hints of hostility toward the clergy, toward the church, and most terribly, toward the Jews. By 1349, Clement had come to see the flagellants as a danger not only to the order of the church, but to the safety of the very communities they claimed to save. In October of that year, he issued a bull condemning the movement and forbidding its processions. And so, in the summer of the greatest catastrophe the medieval world had ever known, a pope sat between two fires and made choices. He defended the innocent when it would have been easier to look away. He restrained a movement of terrified believers when it would have been safer to say nothing. He did not stop the plague. No one could. But he refused to let the plague be used as an excuse for every other evil that fear could invent. In a story so full of darkness, it is worth pausing on that small, stubborn light before we return to the roads outside Avignon, and to the ordinary parishes where ordinary priests were about to face their own long, quiet trials. While popes and princes made their decisions in palaces of stone, the true weight of the plague fell, as it always does in such times, on the ordinary parishes of ordinary villages, where ordinary men and women lived out their small, dutiful lives in the shadow of a catastrophe none of them had asked for. It is here, in these quieter places, that the story of the Black Death becomes at once most terrible and most human. For every named cardinal who died in Avignon, there were 100 parish priests whose names history has almost lost, and it is their vigils, their masses said over empty pews, their register entries written in fainter and fainter ink, that carry the truest measure of what those years cost. Let us go, then, to one such parish, somewhere in the rolling country of southern England, in the year of our Lord 1349. We do not need to place it too precisely. Its story could belong to 100 villages between Dorset and Yorkshire, or to 1,000 more across the fields of France, Germany, and Italy. Let us imagine, as many historians and novelists have imagined before, a village of perhaps 400 souls, gathered around a small stone church with a squat tower, a churchyard shaded by yews older than memory, and a parish priest whom we will call, as many priests of that age were called, Brother Thomas. He may not have existed in exactly this form, but priests very much like him existed everywhere, and their stories, gathered from wills and chronicles and parish records, allow us to speak of him with some confidence. Thomas was a Franciscan friar, one of the wandering brothers of St. Francis who had, in his younger years, walked from town to town preaching and begging for his bread. In middle age, he had been sent to help serve a rural parish whose own priest had died some years before, and he had stayed. He was, by the winter of 1348, a familiar figure in the lanes of the village, a man in his late 40s, thin from long fasting, with a scarred hand from a boyhood accident and a voice that carried well in the small nave of the church. He kept the parish register in his own careful hand, a plain book of thick paper bound in leather, in which he noted the baptisms and the marriages and the burials of his people. He wrote in Latin, in a script trained by years of copying, and he wrote slowly, because he believed each name deserved its own moment of care. Word of the sickness had reached the village long before the sickness itself. Travellers passing through in the summer of 1348 had brought stories from the ports. A carter had spoken of Bristol, where whole streets were said to be shut up and where the bells rang for the dead all day long. A pilgrim on his way home from a shrine had spoken of London, of pits dug beyond the walls into which the dead were laid without coffins. Thomas had listened to these accounts as he listened to all things with quiet attention, and he had told his people from the pulpit that they should not despair, for the mercy of God was greater than any sickness, and that they should pray and confess their sins and love one another as Christ had commanded. He had believed his own words when he spoke them. He would go on believing them, though the believing would grow harder as the winter came on. The first death in the parish, so far as anyone remembered later, was a shepherd's son, a boy of about 15 who had gone down to the market in a nearby town at the end of Advent and returned with a fever. He was dead within 4 days, and by then 2 of his sisters were sick as well. Thomas was with him at the end. He anointed him with the holy oil, kept for such purposes in a small silver vessel, and he heard, in the boy's last minutes, a confession so short and so ordinary that it seemed almost a child's, small resentments, small greeds, small forgotten prayers. He gave him absolution, and he closed his eyes when the breath had gone out of him, and then he walked back to the church through the snow to write his name in the parish register. Thomas wrote it carefully, as he always did. He did not yet know that this was the first of what would become a long, long list. Within a month, the sickness had entered a dozen houses. Thomas walked from one to the next, carrying his oil and his book of prayers and a small wooden cross that he had carried since his novitiate. He knew, as every priest by then knew, that to enter the room of a plague sufferer was to risk his own life. He entered anyway. He believed that this was what a shepherd of souls was for. He heard confessions in low voices from men and women who could barely speak, some of them people he had baptized in the same church 20 and 30 years before. He gave them the last rites of the church, the words in Latin, the sign of the cross, the promise that God's mercy was wider than any suffering. He held their hands when their families would not, and when their families had already died. He walked home at night through lanes so quiet that he could hear the frost cracking in the hedgerows, and he prayed as he walked, and he prayed sometimes without knowing what he was praying for. The parish register in these months grew heavier in his hand. In an ordinary year, Thomas might have entered a dozen burials, spread across the seasons, an old widow in the winter, a labourer in a haying accident in the summer, a newborn who did not live to see its christening. Now the burials came 4 and 5 in a week, and then 5 and 6 in a day. He wrote them steadily, each name with its date, each entry finished with the small mark he used to indicate a soul commended to God. He noted the names of husbands and wives buried on the same day. He noted a household of 7 that was reduced to a single child in the space of 10 days. He noted his own friends among the entries, without comment, because there was no room in the register for anything more than the truth, and the truth was already almost more than the pages could hold. The other Franciscan brothers who had shared the small friary with him began to die as well. There had been 8 of them when the summer began. By Candlemas of 1349, there were 5, and then 3. Thomas buried each of them in the churchyard beside the church. In Grave, he sometimes had to help dig himself because the sexton was ill and would not last the week. He said the office of the dead over each of them, alone at first, then with only 1 or 2 of the villagers who still had the strength to attend. He wrote their names in the register, one after another, in the same careful hand. When he wrote the name of Brother Anselm, his oldest companion, a man he had known for 20 years, he did not weep. He had by then forgotten how. He simply set down the pen, closed the book, and went to attend to the next sick house. Around the village, the ordinary rhythms of medieval life staggered and broke. The mill still turned when there was grain to grind, but there was less grain, because fewer hands had been in the fields the summer before, and now the reeve who oversaw the Lord's domain was dead, and no one had yet come to replace him. The manor court did not meet, because the Lord himself had fled to a town he believed safer, and would die there, and his heir was a boy of 10. The alehouse closed its shutters for weeks at a time. Marriages were postponed, then quietly forgotten. Children who should have been at their lessons with the parish clerk instead sat by the beds of dying parents, or ran wild along the lanes with a strange, brittle freedom. In some villages nearby, so travellers said, the sickness had killed nearly everyone, and the fields had grown thick with weeds, and the sheep had wandered untended into the forest. The chroniclers of the age tried, in their various tongues, to describe what this collapse felt like from the inside. A monk of the abbey at Rochester, whose name has come down to us as William Denny, wrote that the plague had so weakened the world that hardly anyone knew how to work with his hands, and that the fields were left unploughed, and the harvests unreaped, and that the little children who survived their parents wandered about as if they belonged to no one. Henry Knighton, a canon at Leicester, wrote that in one manner after another, the sheep and the cattle wandered through the corn without a shepherd, and that many of them died of hunger or of disease in the fields, because there was no one to gather them in. Jean de Venette, a Carmelite friar in Paris, wrote that in his own convent, of 140 brothers, only 20 were left alive, and that in the great cemetery of the Innocents, the dead were carried in carts from every parish of the city, until the earth itself seemed to be rising with them. Estimates of the toll, made across generations by scholars poring over tax rolls and manorial records and church accounts, converge on a truth that is easier to state than to feel. Somewhere between a third and a half of the population of Europe died in the great pandemic of 1347 to 1353. In some regions, the figure was even higher. In some cities, it was lower. But across the continent as a whole, the loss was so vast that historians now speak of it as the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded European history. Behind that figure lie tens of millions of individual deaths. Behind it lie Brother Anselm and the shepherd's son, and the household of 7 reduced to 1, and the parish register in a small English church whose entries grew longer and longer through the winter of 1349. Thomas himself fell ill in the early spring of that year. He had felt the weariness in his bones for weeks, though he had told himself it was only the strain of his long visits. One morning, after a night spent at the bedside of a dying woman on the far side of the parish, he came home to his cell in the friary and could not rise from his cot the next day. The buboes appeared beneath his arms by the second night. He asked one of the remaining brothers to bring him the parish register. With a hand that had begun to tremble, he wrote in the names of the 2 people he had attended in his last week, entered them with the same small mark he had always used, and set the pen down. He did not write his own name. Someone else, one of the last brothers of the friary, would do that a few days later, in a shakier hand, near the very bottom of a page that was almost full. Above his entry, only one other name remained. Below it, on the next page, the register would continue in yet another hand, thinner and less practiced, for the world did not end when Brother Thomas died. It simply grew quieter and older and stranger than it had been the year before. When the worst of the dying had passed, and the survivors at last dared to lift their heads and look around them, they found themselves living in a world that no longer quite fit. The fields were still there. The rivers still ran. The stone churches still stood, some of them a little more silent than before, some with weeds already growing between the flagstones of their porches. But the human world that had draped itself over that landscape, the world of custom and obligation and inherited place, had been torn in ways that could not be mended by any prayer or any decree. In the years between about 1350 and 1360, and then more visibly in the decades that followed, Europe began to discover that it had become a different kind of society, almost against its will. The first great change was one of simple arithmetic. A continent that had held perhaps 70 or 80 million souls before the plague now held, by the most careful modern estimates, closer to 40 or 50 million. In some regions, the loss was even more severe. Entire villages had been swept away, their houses left standing empty, their fields returning slowly to scrub and coppice. In the English countryside, the traces of these lost villages can still be seen from the air today. Low ridges in the grass where houses once stood, faint lines of old lanes, the shadow of a church whose stones were long ago carried away for other buildings. Contemporaries did not need aerial photographs to notice. They walked past these empty places every day. They knew, in the plain evidence of their own eyes, that there were fewer people in the world than there had been a few years before. That absence, terrible as it was, altered the balance of every relationship medieval society rested upon. Consider, first, the relationship between the lord and the peasant. Before the plague, in most parts of Europe, the great problem for those who owned land had been the abundance of laborers. There were always more hands than there was work for them to do, and this fact allowed lords to demand a great deal in exchange for very little. Rents were high, wages were low. Serfs were bound to the land and could not leave without their lord's permission. Free peasants, though nominally at liberty, had few options for improving their lot, because if they left one manor, they were unlikely to find better terms at the next. The whole structure of the countryside had rested, quietly, on the assumption that a lord could always find another peasant if the one before him displeased him. The plague had reversed that assumption. Suddenly, in field after field, there were more furrows than ploughmen, more sheep than shepherds, more looms than weavers, more houses than tenants. In the first years after the great mortality, the ordinary rules of the manorial world simply stopped working. A laborer who had grumbled for years about the size of his obligations discovered that if he walked half a day's journey to the next village, he could find a lord who was so desperate for hands that he would pay him twice what he had ever been paid before. A young widow who had been trapped for years in her late husband's holding, unable to remarry beneath her station and unable to find one above it, discovered that the son of a neighboring miller was suddenly quite willing to overlook her lack of dowry, because his own family's fortunes now depended on securing any partner who could work. Wages rose with a speed that astonished the record keepers of the age. In England, where the manorial records are unusually rich, historians can trace the change with something close to precision. In some regions, The daily wage of a common agricultural laborer doubled within a few years of the plague's arrival. The wages of skilled workers, such as carpenters and thatchers and masons, rose almost as steeply. The cost of rented land, on the other hand, began to fall because there were more empty holdings than there were tenants who wished to take them up. Lords who had grown accustomed to a steady stream of rents and services suddenly found themselves negotiating from a position of weakness. They offered lower rents, shorter terms, better cottages. They forgave old debts. They quietly overlooked services that they would once have insisted upon. The response of the ruling class to these changes was, at first, denial and repression. In England, King Edward III, on the advice of his council, issued the Ordinance of Labourers in June of 1349, while the plague was still active, and then a fuller Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws attempted to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels, to compel able-bodied workers to accept employment at those rates, and to punish both workers who demanded more and employers who paid more. It was, on parchment, a remarkable attempt to legislate the past into continued existence. On the ground, it did not work. Enforcement was patchy. Lords who complained loudest about the greed of their workers were often the same lords who quietly paid above the statutory rate when they needed a harvest brought in. Labourers who were fined in one manor court simply moved on to another, and the churchwardens of the next parish, glad of any hand willing to work, asked few questions. Similar laws in France, in Castile, in the German lands, met similar fates. The old world could be commanded on paper. It could not any longer be commanded in the fields. Alongside these economic tremors ran deeper, quieter changes in the way people lived. The plague had done more than reduce numbers. It had shaken the ordinary confidence that the young would outlive the old, that a family that entered a year with 5 children would finish it with 5, that a village that had stood for 4 centuries would stand for 4 more. In the years after the mortality, one sees, in wills and in letters, and in the reflections of thoughtful chroniclers, a certain new attention to the present moment. Wills became more numerous, more detailed, more anxious. Even people of modest means, who had rarely bothered with such documents before, now took care to specify who should inherit their small parcels of land, their few coins, their tools, their beds. Bequests to the church grew more common, partly out of piety, partly out of an urge to leave something behind that would outlast the shivering uncertainty of ordinary life. Chantries were founded in great numbers, small endowments that paid a priest to say masses for the soul of the founder in perpetuity, so that even after death one's name would still be heard in the mouth of a living voice. Marriages, too, changed their patterns in ways that historians have traced with growing clarity. In many parts of northwestern Europe, women who had once married very young now married later, often not until their mid-20s. Households became more likely to consist of a single married couple and their children, rather than the great sprawling extended families of earlier generations. Servants moved from house to house with a new fluidity, and a young woman who might once have been trapped in her father's cottage until an arranged match could now, in some places, take service in a nearby town, save her wages, and marry a man of her own choosing when she was ready. It would be a mistake to romanticize these changes. Life for the ordinary laboring woman remained hard, unequal, and short by our standards, but the plague had opened small doors that would not easily be closed again. The church, too, that great institution which had stood at the center of everything, found itself weakened in ways that only slowly became visible. Many of its most learned men had died. Whole monasteries had been reduced to a handful of agging brothers, or had shut their gates altogether. The rapid replacement of priests killed by the plague meant that in many parishes, the men who now stood at the altar were younger, less well-trained, and sometimes barely literate. Complaints about ignorant or worldly clergy, which had of course existed long before, now grew louder and had more substance behind them. In some regions, dioceses struggled for a generation to bring their clergy back to the standard they had held before 1348. In others, the loss of learning was more permanent. Universities lost their masters. Cathedral schools closed. It would take decades for the intellectual life of Christendom to recover the depth it had held in the years just before the plague. And some historians would argue that in certain respects it never fully did, because the recovery, when it came in new forms. Popular religion, meanwhile, took on colors that reflected the shock of what had happened. Preachers spoke more often and more insistently of the shortness of life and the certainty of judgment. Artists painted new subjects or old subjects in new ways. The dance of death became a familiar image on the walls of churches and cemeteries, a procession of skeletons leading away kings and cardinals and peasants and children, each hand in hand with a bony partner, each with the same destination. The three living and the three dead, an older motif, gained fresh urgency. Three young nobles ride out hunting and are met by three corpses, standing upright in their shrouds, who speak the terrible line that generations would learn by heart. As we are now, so once were you. As we are, you shall be. Painters filled entire chapel walls with these figures, and worshippers stood before them in silence and understood. At the same time, and quite unexpectedly, the survivors of the great mortality found themselves, in many places, materially better off than their parents had been. Wages were higher. Rents were lower. Land, in some regions, was cheaper than it had been in living memory. A peasant family that had endured the loss of two children and a grandmother might, 5 or 10 years later, find itself in possession of two holdings instead of one, or in a house with an extra room, or with a small herd of sheep where before there had been 3 ewes. Ale was drunk more often at ordinary tables. Meat appeared on the plates of labourers more regularly than it once had. Wills of ordinary rural people from the second half of the 14th century begin to mention things that would once have been the property of the well-to-do: an iron pot, a good wool coat, a bed with a proper mattress, a small silver spoon. The catastrophe had, in a strange and terrible arithmetic, redistributed the world's goods among fewer hands. None of this made anyone forget what had been lost. The wealth of the surviving peasant did not bring back her sister. The higher wage did not fill the empty stool at the tavern. The extra room in the cottage did not restore the voice that had once filled it. But it did mean that the world into which the survivors had walked was not simply a poorer, sadder version of the one they had known. It was a different world, with different rules, in which the old certainties of lord and serf, of place and obligation, of endless plenty of hands and endless shortage of land, no longer held in the way they once had. The seeds of a new order had been planted, quite without anyone's intention, in the pits that had been dug outside the walls of every city and every village in Christendom. In the sections that follow, we shall see how those seeds began, slowly and unevenly, to grow, and how a medieval world that had believed itself eternal began the long, half-conscious business of turning into something else. The changes that had taken root in the fields and the manor houses did not remain there. They spread, in the years after the great mortality, into every corner of European life, from the councils of kings to the workshops of the smallest towns. In some places, this movement was gradual and almost invisible, a matter of small adjustments made year by year until, one day, the world simply looked different than it had. In other places, the pressures released by the plague broke to the surface in ways that shook thrones and shattered old assumptions. To understand what the Black Death had done, one must follow it out of the parish and into the wider world, into rebellions and wars and quiet acts of moral reckoning that stretched across a full generation and beyond. Consider first the great uprising that came to the Kingdom of France in the summer of 1358. It was called the Jacquerie, from the mocking name that French nobles gave to their peasants, Jacques Bonhomme, meaning something like poor simple Jack. It broke out in the region north of Paris, in the countryside of the Beauvaisis, and it spread within days across the Isle de France and into neighboring provinces. Its immediate causes were tangled: the ruin of the 100 Years' War, the humiliation of the French crown after the capture of King John II at the Battle of Poitiers 2 years earlier, the demands of ransom and taxation that fell heavily on villages already emptied by plague, and the depredations of unemployed soldiers who roamed the countryside taking what they wished. Behind all these lay a deeper impatience, the sense of peasants who had lived through unspeakable losses and who could no longer see any reason to bow to the men who had failed them. The rising was brief and terrible. Peasant bands, sometimes numbering in the thousands, attacked manor houses and castles, killed knights and their families, burned charters that recorded ancient obligations. Chroniclers, most of whom wrote from the side of the nobility, described their violence in tones of horror that were not entirely unearned, though the horror was returned in kind. The nobility, once they recovered from their initial shock, gathered themselves into a coalition led by Charles the Bad, King of Navarre, and struck back with a ferocity that dwarfed anything the peasants had done. Villages were burned. Suspected rebels were hanged from trees along the roads. Within a few weeks, the Jacquerie had been crushed, and the countryside of northern France entered a long period of sullen exhaustion. Yet the rising itself would be remembered, and not only by those who had suffered from it. It was the first great sign that the old assumption of quiet obedience among the tillers of the soil could no longer be taken for granted. Something had shifted in the way the men and women of the fields understood their own worth. A similar shifting made itself felt across the Channel in the summer of 1381, when the peasants' revolt swept through the counties of England. Its causes were more focused, though no less deep. A series of poll taxes, levied to fund the seemingly endless war in France, had fallen with special cruelty on ordinary households, since each adult was assessed at the same rate regardless of means. The commissioners sent to collect these taxes had, in some places, behaved with a coarseness that offended even the modest expectations of villagers accustomed to being squeezed. In Essex and in Kent, resistance began among craftsmen and small farmers who refused to pay or who paid only under threat. It grew rapidly. Within weeks, bands led by men whose names have come down to us, Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, John Ball, were marching on London. John Ball, a wandering preacher who had been in and out of episcopal prisons for years, gave voice to the rebels' deeper convictions in a way that even his enemies remembered. In one of the most famous sermons of the age, he asked the crowd gathered on Blackheath a question that pierced the whole medieval order. When Adam delved and Eve span, he asked, who was then the gentleman? It was a question whose logic ran directly back to the plague years, whose upheaval had made it thinkable to ask such a thing aloud. If the world had been made anew by God after Eden, and if all men descended from a common pair, then by what right did some ride while others walked, some feast while others starved, some inherit while others toiled? The chroniclers who recorded his words did so partly in horror, but they wrote the words down, and the words have never quite been erased since. The revolt itself came close to the throne. Rebels entered London, burned the palace of the Duke of Lancaster, opened the prisons, and killed several high officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, who was dragged from the Tower of London and beheaded on Tower Hill. The young King Richard II, only 14 years old, rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End and again at Smithfield. And there, in encounters that later chroniclers would embroider almost beyond recognition, promises were made. Wat Tyler was killed by the Mayor of London in a scuffle whose truth is still disputed, and the rebellion, deprived of its leadership and cajoled by royal assurances that would soon be broken, dissolved. In the weeks that followed, the promises made under duress were revoked, and rebels were hunted down and hanged. Yet, as with the Jacquerie, the deeper truth of the revolt could not be undone. The idea that ordinary Englishmen could march on their own capital, kill an archbishop, and force their king to parley with them had entered the imagination of the age. The peasants' revolt was not directly caused by the Black Death. Its immediate trigger was the poll tax, and its ambitions were shaped by a whole generation of local grievances. But the confidence of its leaders, the fluidity of the labor market that had made small farmers wealthy enough to think of themselves as free, the sermons of preachers like John Ball who spoke openly of a world in which the old distinctions no longer held, all these were, in part, gifts of the great mortality. In a countryside emptied by plague, the surviving laborer had learned that his hands were precious, and that his voice, in consequence, might be worth listening to. The lords who fought to reimpose the old order were, in a real sense, fighting against the arithmetic that the plague had written into the fields. While the countryside stirred, the towns underwent their own quieter transformations. In many cities, the guilds that regulated crafts and trade faced a crisis. Masters had died in great numbers, apprentices had never returned, and the careful hierarchies of skill and privilege that had governed workshops for generations now had gaps that could not easily be filled. Some guilds responded by loosening their rules, admitting new masters more easily, permitting outsiders to practice trades that had once been jealously guarded. Others tightened, using the crisis to exclude newcomers and protect the surviving members from competition. In cities like Florence, the tensions between the wool workers and the great cloth merchants who employed them broke out openly in the Ciompi Revolt of 1378, a rising of unskilled and semi-skilled workers who briefly seized power in the city and demanded a share in its governance. Their revolt too was crushed, but like the others, it left behind a memory that would not be forgotten. The urban laborer, like his rural cousin, had learned that he could speak in his own name. At a more intimate level, the culture of European Christendom began to reveal marks that would take centuries to fade. In art, the images of death multiplied. The dance of death, which we have already mentioned, spread from painted church walls into printed broadsheets in the next century. Tombs began to be carved with the double image of the deceased, above as they had been in life, robed and dignified, below as they were now, a decaying corpse or a skeleton beneath a shroud. These trancy tombs, as they are called, are among the most unsettling monuments in any European cathedral, and they speak with an eloquence no chronicler could match of the shift in imagination that the plague had brought. In literature, the shadow of the plague fell across a whole generation of writers, and often, paradoxically, produced work of astonishing vitality. We have already met Boccaccio, whose Decameron used the plague year as its frame. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer, a boy of about 7 when the pestilence first struck his country, would grow up to write his Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, and in them he gave voice to a society in which pilgrims from every walk of life, knight, miller, prioress, wife of Bath, cook, ploughman and priest, could ride together on the same road and speak to one another with a certain wary equality. The world he described was not a world without lords and ladies, but it was a world in which the old lines had grown noticeably more porous. William Langland, another contemporary, wrote his long allegorical poem Piers Plowman during these decades, a work suffused with anxiety about labor, poverty, and the responsibilities of both rich and poor. His ploughman hero, a common laborer, becomes a figure of Christ himself. Such an identification, so ordinary to us now, was not accidental in an age that had learned, at terrible cost, how much the world depended on the hands that worked its fields. In the wider church, the same generation saw the beginnings of religious currents that would eventually reshape all of Christian Europe. In England, John Wycliffe, a scholar at Oxford, began in the 1370s to question the authority of the papacy, the wealth of the church, and the doctrine of the Mass in ways that would provide inspiration for the later Lollard movement, and through them, indirectly, for the reformers of the next century. In Bohemia, Jan Hus would take up related ideas in the years around 1400 and pay for them with his life. These movements had many roots, but they grew in a soil that the plague had turned. The visible failures of the church during the mortality, the deaths of learned men, the desperate ordinations of poorly trained priests, the visible worldliness of prelates who had not stayed with their flocks, all these had loosened the ground beneath old certainties. Reformers of every stripe found an audience more willing to listen than any their grandfathers had known. By the end of the 14th century then, and still more clearly in the 15th, Europe had become a place where old hierarchies still stood, but stood less securely, where old assumptions were still spoken, but spoken with more effort, where old institutions still commanded loyalty, but had to earn it in ways they had not needed to earn it before. The kings still ruled. The nobles still hunted their forests. The bishops still processed through their cathedrals. Yet beneath them all, in the fields and workshops and parish churches, a quieter revolution had begun to hum. The medieval world had not ended with the plague. Its ending would take many more generations and would involve many other forces, wars and reformations and voyages and inventions. But the hinge had turned. In the sections that remain, We shall watch that hinge continue to move, as the plague itself returned in wave after wave, and as Europe, altered forever by its first great trial, began to shape the world that would follow. It is tempting, when we speak of the Black Death, to think of it as a single storm that broke over Europe in the years between 1347 and 1353, and then, having done its terrible work, retreated back into the depths of history. That is not what happened. The great pandemic of those years was only the first and most violent visit of a companion who had come to stay. For more than 3 centuries after the initial mortality, the plague returned to European towns and countryside again and again, sometimes in small local outbreaks, sometimes in vast regional catastrophes that killed tens of thousands in a single summer. To live in Europe from the middle of the 14th century until nearly the beginning of the 18th was to live within reach of a shadow that never entirely lifted. The first return came within a single generation. In 1361, only some 12 years after the initial mortality had subsided in most of Western Europe, a fresh wave of plague swept across the continent. Contemporaries called it the pestis secunda, the second pestilence, and in some places they called it the mortality of the children, because it seemed to fall with special weight upon the young. This was not an accident of superstition. The infants and small children who died in this second wave were those who had been born after 1348, and who therefore had never been exposed to the earlier outbreak. Whatever partial immunity survivors of the first mortality may have carried, these children did not have. Households that had wept through the first plague and had then begun the slow work of rebuilding around new babies and small grandchildren found themselves weeping again over cradles and small grave. Chroniclers who had thought they had already seen the worst discovered that grief has more depths than any single year can uncover. A third wave followed in 1369 and a fourth in the later 1370s, and after that the outbreaks blur together in the records, because the plague settled into a rhythm of irregular but recurring visitations. In any given region of Europe, one might expect a serious outbreak roughly every 10 to 15 years across the late medieval and early modern centuries, though the pattern varied. Some cities were struck harder and more often than others. Ports, unsurprisingly, tended to suffer earliest and most frequently, since the disease continued to travel by ship along the same routes that had carried it in the first place. Marseille, Genoa, Venice, Naples, Barcelona, Lisbon, London, and Hamburg all endured repeated visitations that shaped the character of their civic life. Inland cities suffered too, though sometimes with slightly longer intervals between crises. The response of European governments to these repeated waves became one of the great slow-moving stories of the age. The Venetian experiment with quarantine, which we have already mentioned, spread and deepened. By the 15th century, the great port cities of the Mediterranean maintained permanent lazarettos, isolation hospitals set on islands or on the edges of harbors, where arriving ships and their crews could be held under observation. The word lazaretto itself came from Santa Maria di Nazareth, the name of a Venetian island used for this purpose, blurred over time with the biblical figure of Lazarus, the beggar covered in sores. Cities began to appoint health boards, small standing committees of physicians and citizens charged with monitoring outbreaks and issuing regulations. Milan, under its Visconti and Sforza rulers, became particularly famous for the vigor of its plague controls. When a house was found to contain a case of plague, its inhabitants might be sealed inside for weeks. Their food would be delivered through a window. A cross would be painted upon the door. Neighbors would watch and pray and hope. These measures were imperfect and sometimes savage in their effects, but they represented something new in the history of European governance. For the first time on any real scale, secular authorities took upon themselves the direct management of public health as a matter of civic responsibility. Physicians were retained by cities at public expense. Death rolls were kept and published, sometimes weekly. Bills of mortality, listing the causes of death in each parish, began to appear in cities like London by the late 16th century and became a source of both anxious study and grim humor. From these bills, in the 17th century, a merchant named John Graunt would draw the first modern statistical observations about human populations, and a whole new science of demography would eventually rise from the counting of the dead. In this quiet way, the plague did not only kill, it taught. It taught societies to measure themselves, to think in numbers, to imagine the invisible patterns behind the visible losses. Medicine, for its part, evolved slowly and unevenly. The theoretical frameworks of the great Paris masters of 1348 remained influential for a long time, but they were joined and eventually challenged by other traditions. Physicians began to write plague tracts, short works of advice for lay readers, in which they distilled such observations as they had. Some of these tracts, especially those written by Islamic physicians in Andalusia and North Africa, made careful notes on the contagious nature of the disease, on the risks of contact with the sick, on the geography of outbreaks. In Europe, the figure of the plague doctor eventually took on the visual form that later centuries would remember: a long, dark coat, a mask shaped like a bird's beak filled with aromatic herbs, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat. The costume dates from the 17th century, not from the 14th, but it captured a truth that the earlier generations had glimpsed. Between the doctor and the disease, there needed to be a barrier, if only one made of leather and herbs. The final great Western outbreaks came in the 17th century. In 1630, Milan was devastated. Between 1665 and 1666, London endured its own great plague, later overshadowed, but not erased by the fire that followed. In 1720, Marseille suffered a terrible epidemic when a merchant ship, the Grand Saint Antoine, brought the disease from the Levant, and the city was quarantined by land as well as sea in an effort, only partly successful, to contain it. This Marseille outbreak is generally considered the last major appearance of plague in Western Europe. After it, for reasons that historians and biologists still debate, the disease receded from the western half of the continent, though it lingered in parts of the east and reappeared in other regions of the world into the modern era. Improved sanitation, changes in housing, shifts in the rat population, and perhaps the slow ecological rebalancing of the disease itself all seem to have contributed. The plague did not vanish. It moved on. And in the meantime, Europe had spent nearly 4 centuries learning to live with it. That long learning marked the culture of the continent in ways that ran deeper than statistics. In every generation, families passed down, in stories and half-remembered warnings, the memory of previous outbreaks. Grandmothers who had survived the plague of their childhood told their grandchildren how to recognize the first signs, how to keep the sick room, how to arrange for the burial. Prayers to certain saints, above all Saint Roch and Saint Sebastian, were repeated in every parish where the disease had struck, and shrines to them dotted the pilgrim roads. Confraternities, lay religious brotherhoods, took on the work of caring for the sick and burying the dead. These confraternities became a distinctive feature of urban life across Catholic Europe, and their members, robed in black, moved through the streets in every outbreak with a solemnity that recalled, in ritual form, the ordinary courage of the parish priests who had gone before them. The plague also shaped the way Europeans thought about time itself. Before the mortality, medieval calendars had been dominated by the great cyclical festivals of the Church, by the agricultural rhythms of sowing and harvest, and by the reign years of kings and popes. After the plague, and with each new outbreak, a different kind of memory added itself to these. People began to speak of before and after. In the wills and letters of the late 14th and 15th centuries, one often finds phrases like "before the great mortality" or "since the pestilence." These were not neutral markers. They divided a life into ages, before the world had shown its teeth and after. For the survivors of a bad outbreak in one's own town, one carried within one's memory a personal calendar of losses. The year the cousins died. The summer the bells did not ring. The autumn the fields were left standing. Beyond Europe, the same pandemic that had struck the West had, in the same years, done its work across the eastern half of the Eurasian world. Historians now know that the Black Death was not simply a European event. It swept across the Islamic Middle East, from Cairo to Damascus to Baghdad, causing devastation that some scholars believe was as severe as that suffered in Europe. Ibn Khaldun, the great North African historian, who had lost both his parents in the outbreak, wrote of it in words that recall Boccaccio's own. It was, he said, as if the voice of existence in the world had called out for oblivion and restriction, and the world had answered its call. The Mamluk cities of Egypt and Syria never quite recovered their previous population. The trade routes across the Sahara altered. The intricate economic systems of the medieval Islamic world, like those of Christendom, were bent and reshaped by the same invisible force. In China too, in India, in Central Asia, epidemics of the same century struck with variable severity, and the great political shifts of that age, including the eventual retreat of Mongol power, cannot be fully understood without reference to the pestilence. In all of these regions, as in Europe, the initial mortality was followed by long generations of aftershocks. The plague of the 14th century became, in effect, the opening chapter of a pandemic that lasted for centuries. Scholars now speak of a second plague pandemic, distinct from the earlier Justinianic outbreak we have discussed in other stories, and distinct too from the third pandemic that would begin in the 19th century in China and travel by steamship to the harbors of the world. Yersinia pestis, patient guest, would visit again in the age of railroads. It would visit San Francisco in 1900. It would visit Bombay. It would leave its mark on the cities of the Pacific coast of the United States. Only in the 20th century, with the discovery of antibiotics and the development of modern public health, would humanity gain, for the first time in its history, tools that could reliably answer the disease when it came. Even now, plague is not extinct. It survives quietly in wild rodent populations in the American Southwest, in Central Asia, in parts of Africa, and every few years a handful of human cases remind physicians of what once was. Yet for our story tonight, what matters most is that the survivors of the 14th century did not know any of this. They did not know that their children and grandchildren would face the disease again. They did not know how long the shadow would stretch. They only knew from bitter experience that the world had shown itself capable of turning against them, and that they must live within reach of that possibility for the rest of their days. And within that living, quietly, they built a new Europe. In the next section, we shall walk through the fields, the churches, and the marketplaces of that new Europe as it settled into its altered shape, and we shall see how, season by season, the green did indeed return over the pits. In the years and decades after the first great mortality, and between the returning waves of pestilence, ordinary life in Europe went on rebuilding itself in the small, patient ways that ordinary life always does. There was no proclamation that announced the end of the plague years, no ceremony of thanksgiving that closed the account. Instead, one summer arrived that was quieter than the last, then another. Then a year in which no bells rang for the dead beyond the usual toll of old age and accident. Slowly, without daring to say it aloud too soon, the survivors began to trust that they might, for the moment, breathe. The fields were among the first places where that trust took root. In the villages of England, of France, of Germany, of Italy, and of Spain, ploughs moved again along furrows that had lain untouched for a season or two. Some of those fields were smaller than they had been. Others had been consolidated by surviving neighbors who had taken over the holdings of the dead. Still others had been abandoned entirely and would never be ploughed again, so that the forests and heaths of Europe crept a little way back over land that had once been cleared. Historians who study old maps and pollen records can trace this quiet retreat with surprising precision. In some regions of Central Europe, the trees advanced by miles over the course of a century. In parts of England, entire settlements known as deserted medieval villages were left to the grass, their names surviving only in the memory of nearby parishes and in the low earthworks that any walker with a careful eye can still find. Yet the fields that remained under cultivation often produced more, in proportion to the hands that worked them, than they had before. Because there were fewer mouths to feed, farmers could afford to devote more land to livestock. Meadows widened. Herds of sheep and cattle grew in size in many regions. The wool trade, which had been vital before the plague, became still more central to the economies of England, Flanders, and northern Italy. Textile industries in cities such as Florence, Bruges, Ghent, and Norwich adjusted to new conditions, and after painful reorganizations, resumed something like their old vigor. In the countryside, the ordinary diet of the surviving peasant improved, on average, for several generations. Meat, especially in the form of bacon and mutton, appeared more often on plain tables. Ale was brewed more strongly and drunk more freely. Wheat bread, once a mark of the well-to-do, spread further down the social scale, especially in Western Europe. Building resumed as well, though its rhythm changed. In the years immediately after the Great Mortality, large ambitious projects had halted for want of both craftsmen and patrons. Cathedrals stood half-finished. Chapels awaited their vaulting. Bridges waited for their arches. In many towns, work resumed in the second half of the 14th century, though sometimes in a different spirit than before. Some cathedrals, such as Siena, would never complete the enormous expansions their pre-plague ambitions had begun. Others, such as Milan, kept building for centuries in a slower, more deliberate manner. New buildings tended to be more modest, more practical, more focused on the parish and the town than on great monuments of universal Christendom. A generation of masons and carpenters, having survived the mortality with skills suddenly in high demand, taught their trades to apprentices whom they took on gladly, and the crafts recovered. Churches and their bells recovered too, though not everywhere and not evenly. In some parishes, the great bells that had fallen silent for lack of ringers eventually rang again, first for weddings, then for feast days, then for the ordinary Sundays and holy days of the church calendar. In others, the bell towers stood empty for a generation, and children grew up in those places who did not know the sound of a full peal until they were nearly grown. Priests slowly returned to numbers closer to the pre-plague standard, and dioceses that had struggled with poorly trained clergy in the first decades after the mortality began, in some cases, to reform seminaries and to insist again on Latin, on theology, on the careful rubrics of the Mass. The recovery of religious life was uneven and would never quite undo the shocks the plague had delivered. But the ordinary practice of Christian devotion, the baptisms and confessions and last rites that structured a person's passage through the world, resumed its old shape in most places, altered only in small ways that few could name. Trade recovered too. The great fairs of Champagne had already been in decline before the plague, but their functions were absorbed by other centers. The merchants of Lübeck, Hamburg, and their partners in the Hanseatic League continued to bind together the ports of the Baltic and the North Sea, moving grain, timber, furs, salt, and fish along routes their fathers had walked. The Italian trading republics, though bruised, rebuilt their networks. Genoa and Venice sent their galleys once again into the eastern Mediterranean, into the ports of Egypt, of Syria, of the Aegean. Florence, which had lost perhaps 3/4 of its population in the worst years, remained a workshop of the world, its wool and its banking sustaining a life that would soon flower into what later ages would call the Renaissance. It is not an accident that the flowering came when it did. The wealth that funded the paintings of the 15th century, the buildings of Brunelleschi, the sculptures of Donatello, the patronage of the Medici, was in many ways the wealth of survivors, invested by families that had come through the mortality with enough to spare. Slowly, the population began to grow again. It grew unevenly, and it grew slowly, and in many regions it did not reach its pre-plague levels for a long time. In parts of France it would take until the 16th century, and in some places even later. In England, the population in 1500 was still below what it had been in 1300. In Italy, the great cities filled again more quickly than the countryside, drawing in migrants from a countryside that could no longer offer work to all of its sons and daughters. In Iberia, in Scandinavia, in Central Europe, the picture varied. But the underlying trend, once the recurring waves of plague began to weaken in the 15th and 16th centuries, was one of quiet, patient recovery. New Barbies were born into houses that had been half empty. New marriages linked families that had once been strangers. New farms were carved from land that had gone back to scrub. Season by season, decade by decade, the green returned over the pits. The pits themselves, of course, did not disappear. They lay under grass, under the paving stones of churches, under the fields where cows now grazed, under the walls of monasteries and hospitals. In some cities, the Great Plague trenches would be rediscovered centuries later by workmen digging foundations for railways or subways, and the bones of forgotten citizens would come again briefly to the light before being reburied with modern prayers. Archaeologists in London, in Barcelona, in Marseille, in Venice, and in many other places have opened such graves in the 20th and 21st centuries and have used them to answer questions the 14th century itself could not answer. The presence of Yersinia pestis, DNA in the teeth of the dead, first confirmed in the late 20th century and then established beyond serious doubt in the 21st, has settled at last the old debate about the identity of the disease. It was, indeed, the plague. The buboes were what they had always seemed to be. The fleas and the rats had been telling the truth all along. Beneath the surface of ordinary life, other slow shifts were at work. The relationship between the surviving European peasant and his lord, which had already been reshaped by the labor shortages of the immediate post-plague years, continued to change over the following centuries. In Western Europe, serfdom slowly withered. In England, the last legal traces of villanage lingered into the 16th century, but as a practical institution, it was already fading in the 15th. In parts of France and the Low Countries, similar patterns held. In Germany, the picture was more complicated, with some regions moving toward greater freedom and others, especially east of the Elbe, actually intensifying serfdom in what historians sometimes call the Second Serfdom. But in the western half of the continent, the direction of change ran, unevenly and with many local exceptions, toward a peasantry that could move, marry, and negotiate in ways that would have astonished their great-grandparents. The towns, too, took on a new self-confidence. Merchant elites in cities from London to Nuremberg to Milan strengthened their political positions relative to old feudal nobilities. Universities recovered and multiplied, especially in the 15th century, when new foundations at Leuven, at Uppsala, at Basel, at Copenhagen, at Tübingen, and at many other places brought higher learning to regions that had not had it before. Printing, when it arrived in the second half of the 15th century, met a Europe that was hungrier than it had been for 200 years for words on a page. The great flowering of ideas that we call the Renaissance and the reforming movements in religion that we call the Reformation both took place in a Europe whose demographic and economic structures had been reshaped in ways subtle and profound by the plague years and the long recovery that followed. Even the way ordinary people spoke about themselves reflected the change. In wills, in petitions, in the small documents of daily life, more voices began to appear in the vernacular languages of the various regions, in English, in French, in Italian, in German, in Castilian, in Portuguese, in Catalan. Latin remained the language of learning and of the church, but the tongues of the marketplace and the plough spread onto parchment, and later onto printed paper with growing confidence. Chaucer wrote in English. Boccaccio wrote in Italian. Villon wrote in French. The Bible itself would eventually be printed and circulated in the languages of ordinary readers, first by hand and then by press, sometimes at the cost of the printers' lives. This democratization of the written word was not caused by the plague. Its roots lay much deeper, but the plague had helped to loosen the soil in which it grew by shaking the confidence of the old ecclesiastical order and by making the surviving laity feel that its own voice mattered. In the end, the world that emerged from the plague years and their long aftermath was not a world without lords or without priests or without kings. It was still a medieval world in many of its outward forms, and it would go on being so for a long time before the transformations of the 16th and 17th centuries fully overtook it. But at its heart, something had shifted. The certainty that the old order was eternal had been quietly buried in the pits alongside the dead. Even those who defended that order most fiercely now defended it as something that had to be maintained, rather than as something that could simply be assumed. That is the deepest change the plague brought. It did not, by itself, kill the medieval world. It only made it mortal. And once a civilization has learned that it can die, it never quite believes again that it cannot. In our final section, we shall step back one last time to look at the whole shape of that long story and to place it beside our own quieter age. We shall remember the bells that fell silent and the fields that turned green again. We shall think about what the survivors carried with them into the centuries that followed, and we shall say a soft goodnight to the men and women whose ordinary courage held the world together in a season when it might so easily have flown apart. When we look back now, from the safe distance of the 21st century, on the long story we have followed tonight, it can be tempting to see it as a single arc, complete and understood. The ships arrive at Messina. The bells begin to ring. The parishes fill their registers. The pits are dug outside the walls. The survivors count their wages and their empty houses. The old world of lord and serf begins its slow decay, and a new one begins, unnoticed, to take shape in the gaps. Told this way, the Black Death becomes a kind of dark parable, tidy at both ends, whose lesson we can carry safely home. But the men and women who lived through those years did not see any such shape. They saw only the days as they came, one after another, each with its own tasks and terrors and small mercies. It is worth pausing, at the close of our long night together, to remember them not as figures in a moral, but as people, and to consider what their long endurance can still offer to us. The scale of what they endured is difficult to grasp even now. Somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe died in the years between 1347 and 1353. Similar losses fell upon the Islamic Mediterranean, and probably upon large parts of Central Asia and China as well. In percentage terms, no other event in recorded human history, no war, no famine, no other pandemic has ever equaled it. The First World War killed a smaller fraction of Europe's population. The Second World War, taken as a whole, killed a smaller fraction of the world's. Even the great influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, terrible as it was, killed a much smaller share of humanity than the plague of the 14th century. To lose a third of one's neighbors is a wound of a different order than any our own century has been asked to bear. It is worth naming that plainly, so that the courage of the survivors is not diminished by our familiarity with the story. And yet, they did not simply endure as passive sufferers. They chose, again and again, in ways large and small. The Genoese sailors who returned home with their sickness had chosen, weeks earlier, to keep sailing when they might have turned back. The port authorities of Messina had chosen, too late, to close their harbor. Pope Clement VI had chosen to defend the Jews when the whole logic of terror pushed the other way. Brother Thomas, in his imagined but historically true parish, had chosen to enter the sick rooms when he knew what waited there. The peasants of the Beauvaisis had chosen to rise against the knights who had failed them. The masters of Milan had chosen to build lazarettos on their islands. The parish clerks who took up the registers from priests they had helped bury had chosen to keep writing, in their shakier hands, on pages that were nearly full. Every one of these choices was a small refusal to let the disease speak the last word. And it is the sum of those choices, more than any grand movement of history, that carried the world through. Their choices did not save them from grief. They did not save them from injustice. In some places, indeed, they added new injustices to the old. The massacres of the Jewish communities of the Rhineland cannot be softened by anything, and no honest telling of this story would try. The suppression of the Jacquerie and the peasants' revolt was accomplished with a savagery that revealed how much fear the plague years had left in the men who still held power. The exploitation of laborers by lords who quietly ignored their own labor laws, the enclosure of common lands in later centuries, the slow hardening of a new kind of servitude east of the Elbe, all these were part of the aftermath as well, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. History is not a story with a moral neatly attached. It is a long conversation among people who did their best and their worst under conditions they did not choose. Yet it is also true that certain of the choices made in those years planted seeds whose fruit still nourishes us. The insistence, in Avignon, that a plague could not be blamed on the innocent by way of a rumor, however comforting the rumor might feel, is an early ancestor of every modern effort to hold public speech accountable to evidence. The Venetian innovation of quarantine, the appointment of civic health boards, the counting of the dead in weekly bills of mortality, these were the first stumbling steps toward the public health institutions that today track outbreaks around the world in real time. The gradual erosion of serfdom in Western Europe, though it moved for many reasons and against much resistance, was in part the achievement of countless plain men and women who insisted, in courtroom and marketplace, that their labor and their lives were worth more than their grandfathers had been allowed to say. The extraordinary literature and art that emerged in the generations after the plague, the tales of Chaucer, the paintings of the Sienese and the Florentines, the long meditations of the mystics, the songs of the surviving troubadours, were all shaped by hands that had held the dying and had chosen, afterwards, to make something beautiful anyway. It is not romantic to say so. It is simply what the evidence records. For those who lived through the plague years, the deepest question was not political or economic. It was the older question the human heart always brings to catastrophes of this size. Why? Why did my daughter die and not the child next door? Why did the priest who came to bless my father die within the week? Why did the harvest fail in one village and not the one across the river? The medieval world had its answers, and we have already heard them in the language of stars and vapors, of sin and testing, of divine, will beyond human comprehension. Modern medicine has given us different answers in the language of bacteria and rats and fleas and human traffic. Neither set of answers, in the end, quite reaches the place where the question is asked. To lose a beloved to a disease is a grief that no explanation, ancient or modern, entirely dissolves. What the medieval world did understand, perhaps more clearly than we sometimes do, is that grief of this kind cannot be borne alone. It must be carried by a community in shared ritual, shared prayer, shared silence. The bells, when they rang again, rang not only for the dead. They rang for the living who needed to hear that they were still part of something larger than their own sorrow. It is perhaps for this reason that the memory of the plague, though it grew softer over time, never entirely faded. In countless European towns, chapels dedicated to Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian still stand today, built in gratitude by communities that had passed through a particularly bad outbreak. Processions on their feast days linger in some places. In small country churches, one can still find painted images of the dance of death, weathered now, cracked, but recognizable. In museums, the trancy tombs still teach their old lesson in stone and marble. The plague did not become a forbidden subject. It became part of the moral vocabulary of Europe, a reminder built into churches and cemeteries and books that every civilization, however proud, walks in the company of its own mortality. And what does this long story mean for us, listening tonight in our own century, in our own homes, at our own late hours? We do not live under the same shadow. Modern medicine has made the specific disease of the 14th century a rare and treatable illness in almost every part of the world. Our public health systems, imperfect as they are, would have seemed like miracles to the citizens of Messina or Florence or London. And yet we too have known, in living memory, what it is to watch a disease travel along the same routes that carry our commerce and our travel. We too have seen bells fall silent, in the metaphorical sense, when concerts and stadiums and schoolrooms emptied for a season. We too have watched governments and neighbors respond in ways both admirable and terrible. We too have lost people we loved. If the medieval story has anything to say to us, it is not that we are safe now, but that human beings, when tested in this way, are capable of both terrible cruelties and quiet, stubborn courage. That truth is not old. It is as fresh as this year, and the year before, and the years to come. The story we have followed tonight is, in the end, not a story about a disease. It is a story about a world, and about the men and women who lived within it and who did not let it end, even when it must have seemed at times as though it must. They planted the fields again. They rebuilt the workshops. They filled the parish registers with new baptisms. They rang the bells, when at last there were hands enough to ring them, and they went about the small, patient business of tomorrow. In doing so, they became, without knowing it, the ancestors of everything that came after. Every reader who has ever opened Chaucer, every worshipper who has ever knelt in a late medieval church, every citizen who has ever benefited from a quarantine order or a public health notice, every laborer who has ever bargained for a fair wage, stands somewhere in their long shadow. So as we come to the end of our night together, let us not close the story with any grand conclusion. Let us close it, instead, the way the survivors closed their own days. With a look toward the window, where the light of another morning is already beginning to gather, with a thought for those who did not live to see it, with a small prayer or a small silence for the ones we love, with a quiet promise made only to ourselves that we too will do what we can in our own smaller trials to be worthy of the courage that carried an older world through a darker night than ours. Somewhere in a village whose name has been forgotten, the last bell of the plague years is still ringing softly across the fields. Somewhere, a woman is still standing at her doorway in the first spring after the mortality, watching the green come back over ground that had held her children. Somewhere, a parish register lies open at a page where the entries at last begin to slow, and beneath the final name of the terrible year, a new hand has written, in small careful letters, a baptism. Good night, dear listener, wherever you are, whatever hour it is where you sit. Sleep gently. The bells are quiet tonight, and the fields are green.